Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's gardening time. We could spend 90 minutes talking about gardening and then get out there and do it. And I know some of you are already headed out to the garden and you're going to be listening along today. Today, we're going to be talking about soil. And it's more than building the soil, it's growing your soil. And we'll get into that much more in depth and answer your questions along the way. Let's go ahead and start with a question from Paul. What's the best way to deal with an abundance of basil? I harvested a bunch this morning. Good for you. And get on it. Using it fresh is definitely the best way. I completely agree with Lisa, and that's basil pesto. So when I get an abundance of basil, I make pesto. And depending on what I have on hand, pine nuts are traditional, at least here in the States, for making a nice basil pesto. But I like walnuts, and I always have walnuts in my freezer because I like brownies and cookies made with walnuts. So I'd like to make a basil pesto using walnuts. And then this is where the preservation aspect of gardening comes in. I'll make a lot of pesto with a lot of basil, and then I freeze it. And you can either freeze the pesto in an ice cube tray and just take those cubes out to use however you use pesto. I like to spread basil pesto on French bread and then put it in the oven. Absolutely delicious. I like to make pasta and then use the pesto as the pasta sauce, and just simple pasta and simple pesto, simple meal, but tastes delicious. And so that's one of those ways to preserve your basil, because you can dry it, but it loses all of its flavor. And there really aren't better ways. You can preserve it in oil and have an oil that has the basil flavor. But I think a pesto is an ideal way to use all the basil you have. And in fact, I still have frozen pesto in my freezer from the pesto I made last year because I grew so much basil. So give that a shot, Paul, and see what you think about it. And want to give a shout out. Bonjour, Jean-Pierre. Jean-Pierre has brought a few more to our global audience. And so I want to welcome both Luke and Rita from Belgium that are joining our global audience. And then, of course, all the others who have been checking in. It's nice to see everybody here today. The temperatures are definitely increasing for many of us. Melissa's hitting 106 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 41 Celsius. That's hot. And those of you that have been watching for a long time may notice I'm not wearing flannel today. We're finally warming up here. And our temperatures in my garden this week should get pretty close to 90 degrees. That's 32 Celsius. So it wasn't that long ago that I was having freezing conditions and snow. And this week is the first week of the year that my nighttime temperatures have reached 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. And those are magic numbers that I talk about a lot. I don't put my tomatoes out in the garden until the nighttime temperatures reach 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So guess what I'm doing this week? I'm monitoring the soil temperature. It still needs to come up a couple degrees before I put the tomatoes in the ground, but it's wonderful for me to actually finally get to that point that all these plants I've been growing inside are getting ready to go in the garden. I know so many of you are way ahead of me on that respect. So I saw a question. I'm trying to find it from Frank. There we are, having a discussion on the Facebook page about whether or not there's a benefit to pinching potato flowers. And yes, there is a benefit. So the nice thing about potatoes is they tell you when the tubers are beginning to develop, and the flowers will show at that time. Like plants in general, they spend their life, their energy to send out the flowers and the seeds. It's the same with potatoes. If you pinch off the flowers, then all of the energy is going to go into developing the plant. And tubers are just an extension of the stems of the potato plant. They're really not root structures. And so in a normal plant, if you pinch off the flowers, the energy is going to the stems and the leaves and the growth of the plant. Holds true in potatoes as well. So you can expect to get bigger potatoes if you pinch off the flowers. It's not necessary. It's not absolute. I did both last year, and I noticed that the plants that I pinched the flowers off of, the potatoes might have been a little bit bigger, but I didn't notice a huge difference. So how much effort do you want to put into your potatoes to pinch them off? You can expect that it will make a difference, but for the most part, I don't think it's that huge of a difference if you don't want to do it. So I hope that helps, Frank. And I know there's always a lot to do in the garden. And so if you've got other activities that are more important, you can leave the potato flowers for a little bit later. And Rhea, again, welcome. Glad you're here with us today. Is it a good idea to put potato peelings on the compost heap? And so that's a good question. I actually talked about this a week or two ago. And so the general recommendation is that we don't put our potato peelings on our compost heap because potatoes and tomatoes are in the same family and they can pass diseases back and forth. And so the assumption, and I think this is a faulty assumption for many of us, the assumption is that the potatoes have diseases. You put those peelings into a compost pile, then you use that compost in your tomato bed, and you're passing the potato diseases to the tomato. That's the general assumption of why you'll hear people recommend don't put the potato peelings. Now, for the potatoes I buy at the supermarket, I don't know the source of those potatoes. I don't know if those potatoes have a disease. I don't put my potato peelings from the supermarket in my compost pile. But when I grow my own potatoes, at the end of the season, I put the potato plants in my compost pile, and there's always little potatoes that find their way to the compost pile. When I cook with my own potatoes that I've grown, I peel the potatoes and put those peelings in my compost pile because I know, at least in my garden, my potatoes don't have diseases. So there's a 0 chance that I'll be passing potato diseases to my tomatoes. So it depends. If you're buying your potatoes from a source and you don't know whether they may or may not be diseased, I would avoid it. Otherwise, just like any other plant you're growing yourself, I say if you can add any material to the compost pile, add it to the compost pile. I even add my weeds to the compost pile because it's organic matter that will decompose and benefit the rest of the garden as the compost benefits the soil. And that's what we're talking about today is soil. So let's get into, and some of you may have picked up on this. So the title today is different than what I've said in the past. So in the past, I've talked about how to build good soil, and building good soil is putting in those materials, putting in that organic matter, using your own native soil, allowing your native microorganisms that are already in the soil to thrive and create a good soil for you. Putting all of those materials together is building your soil. The next step, once you have all those pieces in place, is to grow a good soil. And I wanted to highlight that difference today, because if you think of your soil as a plant, you'll get better soil. When we're growing a plant, we know that we need to water so the plant will grow. We know that the plant needs nutrients. So whether it's a good soil or fertilizers, we're providing nutrients to the plant. And then as the plant grows, it needs those other factors like warmth and sun to continue growing. Well, it's the same in the soil. If you think of your soil as a living organism, because it's made up of multiple organisms and it is alive. You need to make sure that you keep your soil moist. You need to water your soil. You need to make sure that you're providing nutrients for all of those organisms. So that's where the organic matter comes into play. And you need to recognize that the sun plays a role, that the warmth of your soil will make a difference in how well those organisms are growing. So for those of us where our soil freezes solid in winter, everything shuts down, everything goes dormant, and then in spring, everything pops back to life again. You need to be ready for that in spring, through the summer, and then as the bed goes to sleep in early winter, well, you need to protect your bed. You need to have provided food the whole way, and I always give a store of food for those microbes that are slow in going to sleep in winter, which is why I amend my beds in autumn. And then you cover them. You go to sleep, you want a blanket on you when it's cold outside. So you mulch your soil in winter just to make sure that you're protecting the soil and those microbes that are in the soil. So that's the basic concept and the theme of today. And we'll be talking more about that as the questions come in and as we proceed. James Richter is asking, I'm considering using a compost tea in my garden. Can you tell me if this is wise? And if you think and if you make it, how do you make it? Love your content. Thanks, James. And so I look at this two different ways. And when we talk compost tea, the concept of compost tea is you take something like a 5-gallon bucket, you take compost, ideally compost that you're making that is rich with those microbes, you put it in water, and the most important factor when making compost tea is to aerate the water. So you put a bubbler in it, like from a fish aquarium. So the bubbles are making sure that there's a high oxygen content within the water, because the microbes that are growing in a compost pile are aerobic bacteria. They need oxygen. And if you put them in a bucket of water, you're now putting them into an anaerobic environment with no oxygen. And so the microbes are going to drown. They're going to die. There's not enough oxygen. But if you aerate that water with oxygen bubbles, the microbes can actually survive. And if you give them more food, typically something like molasses, then they'll thrive. And so that's how we make compost tea. For me personally, that's way too much work. I don't do that. I don't do the bubbler, I don't do the molasses, and I don't make compost tea, because the studies I've read show that compost tea can be very effective as a foliar spray. It has antifungal properties. So if you take the tea and spray it on your plants, it can actually have some benefits. I don't have the fungal diseases in my garden on my plants for me to go to all that effort to make compost tea. Instead, what is an alternative is to make a compost extract. Don't do the bubbler, don't do the molasses, just take compost and put it in a bucket of water, allow some of that anaerobic bacteria to take place. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to steep the compost in the water, just like you would steep the tea leaves in water. And the result is water that has absorbed the nutrients from the compost. The bacteria, the microbes are dead, or at least minimized. And so when you use a compost extract as a fertilizer or as a way to add nutrients directly to the plant, that can be beneficial. It can be a quick boost to a soil for plants that need those nutrients, and for a soil that is deficient in those nutrients. I do that occasionally, very rarely. Instead, what I prefer to do is to spread the compost on the soil as a mulch. It will continue to decompose. Those microbes that are in the compost, some of them will actually be transferred to the soil. growing the soil, growing the life in the soil. And then as I water and as it rains, every time I put water on that compost that's on top of the soil, it creates an extract. The water flows through that compost and I've achieved the same results. Those nutrients are now flowing through the compost into the soil to make it more nutrient rich, to benefit the microbes and to benefit the plants. So that's the approach I take is, and so James, when you're asking about making and using compost tea, I have to ask the question, why? And if you're using it or doing it to use as a foliar spray for fungal diseases, then yes, absolutely go with it. If you're doing it to add nutrients to the soil, think of it as an extract rather than a tea. And I think one of the best benefits of compost is to actually amend the soil, put that decomposed organic matter into the soil. And that's actually my preferred method of using compost. So another welcome to Luke asking a question. Can you sow directly into a fresh layer of wood chip mulch 4 inches thick? Absolutely. In fact, I just did this yesterday. And so and this is a picture of my garden. I'll talk about it here in a little bit. So this area behind me right here, those are wood chips and they are about 4 inches thick. And so yesterday I transplanted some of the perennial plants I'm growing. I put some blue sage out there, which should be a beautiful pollinator plant. I put in a prairie drop seed, which is another plant that should benefit the native insects in my area. And in various areas out here, I dropped some annual flower seeds that hopefully will pop up and give me some color towards the end of the season. And so the key is that in each of these areas, and you can almost make out that little bit of green right there, which is where I put some of those plants. You don't sow or you don't plant directly in the mulch. You do need to spread the mulch. You need to get down to the soil. And so for the plants, I moved the mulch aside, dug a hole, put the plants in, and then moved some of the mulch back over that area. Because they're still pretty young plants, they have about an inch of mulch directly around them right now and surrounded by an area with 4 inches of mulch. And then in the areas with seeds, effectively the same thing. I spread aside the mulch and then sowed the seeds directly into the soil. In those areas, I didn't cover back with the wood chip mulch because those little seedlings still need to emerge and start growing. Instead, I just sprinkled a very light layer of dried grass clippings. As those plants grow, then I'll move the mulch back around those plants. So by the end of the season, I should have big cosmos and asters and zinnias, and those plants will have probably about 2 inches of mulch around them by the end of the season. So to your question of sowing directly into the layer of wood chips, I don't sow directly into the wood chips. I move the wood chips aside and sow into the soil underneath the wood chips. And then move the wood chips back depending on how big the plant is and what time of season those plants happen to be at. So hope that helps out. Urban Chicken Mama, nice to see you here today. This is the second year I've added wood chips to the chicken yard. Do you think it's been long enough yet for me to dig down and get compost? Probably. And so the chicken manure is going to help. So whenever you have wood chips on your soil as a mulch, which I love, that's why I've got them all over my yard. For those wood chips to decompose, they're going to require some nitrogen. So if it's bacteria in the decomposition process, they definitely need nitrogen. Most of the decomposition of wood chips is done through fungal action. So that fungi is breaking down the wood chips. They also require some nitrogen. And so the chicken manure is a great source of nitrogen. So by having wood chips in a chicken run, those wood chips are going to break down faster than if they were in an environment where they didn't have a lot of extra nitrogen. And so after 2 years, I bet you probably will have at least a 2 or 3 inch layer of some really nice decomposed material, maybe more, maybe less. A lot of it depends on the moisture content of the last 2 years to aid the decomposition. But get out there, do a test dig, and see what you think. And you might be surprised. I had a wood chip pile, this is almost 20 years ago. First time I got a big load of wood chips to put out of my garden for a mulch. And I got the pile before I was ready to spread them, and then didn't build the garden as fast as I had hoped. And so that big pile of wood chips sat in my garden throughout the summer before I got to it. And it happened to be a relatively wet summer. And by the time I got to those wood chips, I'd say the inner half was almost fully decomposed. Dark, rich, broken down wood chips that were compost at that point. And so you may find something like that depending on how thick the wood chips are that you've been using. Don't be surprised if you don't do a test dig and actually find some really good, dark, rich stuff. I think that's fantastic. Marcia's wondering, can you mix all of your compost components together if you have enough grass clippings, leaves, etc., to make a large pile instead of layering them? Oh yeah, absolutely. And so when we make our compost, layering helps with the ratios. And so depending on what ingredients you're using, your greens and your browns, and depending on what source you're referring to, whether you're doing 4 carbons to 1 nitrogen, or 7 to 1, or 9 to 1, or 21 to 1, a lot of it depends on the material you're using. So the layers make it easier for us to measure out those ratios. And so my pile tends to be about 4 or 5 to 1 brown to green. And so you do a 3-inch layer of green, 4 times that is 12, so you do a 12-inch layer of brown. That's why layers tend to work, so that we can then get an appropriate recipe built. Then, as you allow that material to break down, and then as you turn the pile, things begin getting mixed up. And you know that the ratios are right, and then it's all mixed up, and then before you know it, you've got compost. You don't have to do the layer. You can go ahead and skip that step, and as long as you know that your ratios, that your recipe is close for the greens and the browns, the nitrogens and the carbons, yeah, throw it all into a bucket, in a bag, in a pile, whatever you want to do, and don't think that it has to be a layer. The idea is just to get all of those materials together so that they can benefit each other and then start breaking down. So don't be so concerned about the actual method of layering or not layering, and everything should work out pretty well. Okay, scrolling down. Nice to see Jay and Heidi here again today, of course. Outstanding moderators. Generally, do you not plant vegetables in thick wood chip mulch? At the least, it needs to be pulled back to uncover the planting area. Yeah. And so, so to expand on Luke's question, I use wood chips in areas like this with my perennial garden beds, with my fruit bushes, with my fruit trees. I don't use wood chips in my vegetable garden because it takes a long time for them to decompose. They are robbing nitrogen, at least on the surface. They're not going to rob nitrogen deep down, but there is going to be a nitrogen loss on the surface of the soil where that wood chip mulch is contacting the soil. And then, like I said, in autumn, I turn everything into the soil. All that organic matter is added to my vegetable garden beds. So I'm not using wood chips in my vegetable garden, but it is something you could do, and just pull aside and plant in it, move back over the plants as needed during the course of the season, and it can actually all work pretty well. So nice to see so many people here today. I see some new names. I see a lot of the common names. I see lots of good information being passed back and forth. So awesome. So Gardener Scott, this is from Chris. Is it too late for pumpkins? I have 105 days till the first frost. So I am just now starting my pumpkins in my hugelkultur bed because I finally reached the point that I can do that. Like I talked about, the temperatures are just about right. And so from this point forward, this is a little bit later. Well, actually, it was this time last year that I was doing this, but it's still about 2 weeks later than what has been normal for me. And I expect that I have about 105, maybe 110 good growing days left, and I'm still doing my pumpkins. Now, I have selected the varieties of pumpkins that are closer to 90-day pumpkins. So for me, in my area, winter comes fast, usually in September. And so my pumpkins have to grow quickly. I have to choose those shorter those shorter days to harvest varieties. I'm guessing you're probably going to be able, Chris, to see when the cold is coming. You should definitely have 105 days left. And if you see the cold coming and the pumpkins aren't quite ready yet, you should be able to cover them with plastic later in the season and give them those extra couple days that they're going to need. So you've got a longer season than me, and I'm just now starting to do it. And I do it the same way every year, and every year I get pumpkins. So the key being what the variety is of pumpkin that you're growing, and that will be the most important part of the answer. So if it's a 105-day pumpkin, and that's why you're asking, then I say go for it. And if you need to protect them later on, you can take that little bit of effort, and I'm guessing the pumpkins will be just fine. So, okay, scrolling down, trying to catch up a little bit. Anita's having issues with pill bugs nibbling on bean plants. Someone said put some grass clippings as a mulch around them to let the bugs eat the clippings instead. Yeah, and so pill bugs are actually great for the garden. When I talk about mulch, generally they're going to eat decaying organic matter. And so that's their food of choice. They're going to help break down the mulches that we're putting on our beds, generally. But when there's a lot of them, they will go ahead and start eating the plants. And I had a big problem with that when I lived in Oklahoma and attempted to garden there, was the pill bugs eating the plants to the ground. But I wasn't mulching then. And so the idea of putting down some grass clippings or anything similar to that, that's their primary food. They are decomposers, and they want to eat that decaying matter, like the grass clippings that you would put on the bed. So yeah, absolutely, that's one way to do it. And if you want to trap them, they like cool, moist, damp environments. And so cardboard, again, as a trap, cardboard can be a great trap. Put some wet cardboard near or around that bed and go out in the morning, and you'll probably find a whole bunch of those pill bugs underneath the wet cardboard, and you can get rid of them that way if you want to get rid of them. But yeah, the idea of grass clippings is exactly one of the kind of things you would want to do to give them an alternative food than your plants, because it's the plants that you really don't want them eating. And so give them a smorgasbord someplace else. Okay, I'm going to try to catch up, scroll down, get closer to real time. Amy Stewart's saying, what does the days mark on a seed packet actually mean? From sowing, from germinating? Good question. And so generally, and it does vary, and I've seen some seed companies that have actually started putting in their catalogs exactly what their numbers mean. And it doesn't always match from company to company. But generally, when we say days to harvest, that is when the plant is actively growing in the ground. And so you'll see a tomato plant that's an 82-day tomato. When the tomato plant has been put in the ground, you can expect to start harvesting when everything is perfect, when the weather is ideal, when the soil is getting all of the the water that it needs, when the plants are absorbing all of those nutrients that are in the soil, then 82 days later you'll get the tomatoes. When you sow the seeds, some packets will also give you this information as well. It might be a 65-day cucumber. Some seed packets will say 7 to 10 days germination. That is not included in the days to harvest or in the days on the seed packet. So the germination time is separate. If you are starting from seed out in your garden, you have to allow for that 5 days, 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever it might happen to be, for those plants to germinate. Then after the plant is growing, then the clock starts as to when you'll be able to harvest whatever the type of plant is. And again, it's assuming that your soil has all the nutrients that the plant needs and that you are providing all the normal maintenance to keep the plant alive. And so this gets a lot of us, especially for those of us with very short seasons, it gets a lot of us in trouble because the assumption is you put the seed in the ground and that's when the clock starts. No, you need to wait and give that extra amount of time for the germination. And so back to the question of 105 days for the pumpkins, you need to allow for that. But that's why I wait until the soil is warmer. And so when you have a warm soil, the seeds are going to germinate faster. And for me, my pumpkin seeds are germinating in 3 or 4 days once I wait for the soil to warm up. And 105-day pumpkin really ends up meaning about 120 days with the cloudy days, because if the pumpkins aren't getting full sun, it's going to slow down their growth. And so add a little bit of buffer to most of the days that you see on the seed packets, and that'll give you a better idea. So germination on the front side is not included, and then an extra week or so on the back side for all those cloudy days and all those days that the watering wasn't perfect. And that is really a better idea of the days that it's going to take for those plants to grow and reach the point that you can actually harvest them. So, okay, let's scroll down. I think I missed something on here. What was it? Oh, I thought there was a super chat, but I guess not. I guess there are just some membership stuff going on. So that's awesome. Appreciate all of that. And it's so nice to see everything that you're doing. Thanks, Ivan. I appreciate that. I like to think I'm a good teacher, so I appreciate that well. James is wondering, what do you use for cover mulch in your veggie beds? So I like a combination. So I live in a windy area. I like grass clippings because not only do they cover the ground pretty well, but they decompose quickly when I turn them into the soil. Dried grass clippings mostly. If you use a lot of fresh grass clippings, they can clump up and actually create some problems. I like crushed leaves, and I collect leaves every year. The last couple of years, Frank has done a wonderful job supplying me with bags and bags of leaves. And I like straw. And so I use primarily straw, but because of our winds and because I like the leaves and the grass, because they add different nutrients and they help cover the soil more than just the straw by itself, I'll use a combination. So I typically will mix all three as a mulch in my veggie beds. And if you look back here, those are my straw bales that I bought last year. And that's the straw that I use. I always buy the straw the year before, just in case they might have been sprayed or treated with chemicals that could be hazardous. And I have a video about that I released last year about aminopyralids and other things that you might be concerned about when you use straw. So to have no concerns whatsoever, I like using straw, but I age it outside for almost a year before it actually goes in my garden. And that's it. Those are the mulches that I use in my veggie bed: the straw, the grass, and the leaves. And that actually makes it pretty simple. And then I turn it all into the soil to decompose in autumn and winter and early spring, and it adds organic matter. Again, thinking with that mindset of growing your soil, of always having a source of organic matter in your soil, protecting the top of the soil from the UV rays of the sun, critical factor so it doesn't kill the soil life. Mulch helps do that. And those light mulches in the vegetable garden really make it easy to not only benefit the soil as a mulch, but then to benefit the soil life as a food later on over the course of the decomposition. Cammie's wondering, the same question, but could I grow blueberries and blackberries in 10-gallon tubs successfully? And so, yes, I have a video a couple months old where I show preparing the soil for blueberries, and I'm growing blueberries in pots. They're more than 10-gallon. I think they're 17-gallon pots are the ones I'm using. Blueberries in particular, you can have success in 10-gallon tubs. Blackberries as well, depending on the type of blackberry. 1 or 2 in a tub and allowing them their root development. Yeah, you could definitely do that. But you do need to be aware of the pH of the soil or the soil mix that you're using in that tubs and in those tubs. And that's what I talked about in that recent video was modifying the pH and preparing the pH for growing in containers like that. Hi, Eggnog Brownies. Nice to see you here. I have volunteer pumpkins growing in my compost bin. I'm a bit frustrated that they're so huge and green when the plants I'm growing in my bed are small and yellow. And so that's actually a great example of why compost is so great. Compost is nutrient rich. And same thing, the seeds that pop up in my compost pile are always a beautiful, bright green because they have the nutrients from the compost pile. Use this as a sign, because if your soil is alive, if it has all of those nutrients, if you've added a lot of compost to your soil, then the plants that are growing in your soil should be the same color. They should have the same growth as those that would be growing in your compost pile. So if you see that big of a difference, then it's telling me that your soil where those are growing in a bed needs some help. It needs some more nutrients. It needs some more organic matter. Specifically, it needs your own compost, because you've already demonstrated to yourself that your compost has nutrients to grow plants. So get that compost into your soil, and I think you'll be doing fine. So Troy's asking, how much damage does chlorinated water do to microorganisms? Really none, or minimal. Alberta Urban Gardens is a YouTube channel. He was very active a long time ago, came back and made a couple videos recently, but he's got some great videos where he tests pretty much everything in the garden. So he takes soil, he takes water, and he goes to a lab and does the analysis of the microbes. And he demonstrated, and he's not the only one. I've seen a couple other videos and I've read a couple of papers on the same subject, that the chlorinated water, when we add it to our soil, believe it or not, even that water has active microbe activity in it. It's not sterile by any stretch. And when it gets into the soil, the chlorine tends to dissipate pretty quickly, and the amount of chlorine that's in the water is not enough to have a big effect on the soil. So I live in a city where all of the water is chlorinated, or at least treated. I'm not sure if they're still using chlorine, but it's treated. And that's the water I use in my garden. And I've been growing and harvesting for years and years and years, and the plants do fine. And my soil is alive and it's doing fine. So possible that freshly treated water might impact some microbes, but it's not going to be a big impact. And so, yeah, check out that Alberta Urban Gardens video, and he can actually show you some of the test results of the microbes and treated water, and you'll see it really doesn't make that big a difference. And so I wouldn't worry about it. And oddly, I am more concerned about rainwater. And so rainwater is advocated by a lot of gardeners to avoid the treated city water. You have to think about where that water is coming from. And so if you have a lot of birds in your area and the birds are roosting on your roof and the rain is washing on your roof into the downspouts, into the rainwater that you're collecting, it's possible that rainwater is contaminated with E. coli and all the other diseases that birds can carry and everything else that would be on the roof. And so I don't think it's a good idea to add rainwater to a vegetable garden, because you could be introducing pathogens and potential diseases to your vegetable garden from the rainwater. Rainwater around my trees and my shrubs and my fruit bushes aren't a problem, but I wouldn't use rainwater in the vegetable garden, but I have no problem using the treated water from the city. So hope that helps out as far as saving water. Save rainwater, but just be aware of some of the potential problems if you do use it in your garden. So much activity today. So nice to see everybody going back and forth. Thank you, Sheena's Garden, asking for thumbs up. I appreciate that. And Barbara's asking a question. I'm putting down mulch in walkways of my container garden on grass lawn. Do I need to put down cardboard or weed barrier first? It depends. It depends on what kind of grass is underneath, and depends on how much mulch you're adding. And so for most lawn grasses, at least here in the United States, that we tend to use, a layer of 6 inches of wood chips is enough to smother and kill that grass. If you've got a more pernicious grass like Bermuda grass, and there's a lot of other grasses around the world that are hard to kill, then you probably can get a better effect by putting the cardboard down first to try to smother it, then put a thick mulch on, and that in most cases will smother and kill the plants. So if you're not planning to put down 6 inches of mulch, then cardboard is a good way to start. And then 2 or 3 inches on top of that is a substantial barrier that should kill whatever grass is underneath. But do be aware of the type of grass, because some of the grasses that spread through their rhizomes, through their root system, they'll be threatened by the cardboard and by the mulch, and they'll send out the underground runners beyond the edge of the cardboard, and you'll have them popping up around the edges of those pathways. So it depends on the grass, depends on the thickness, and you may need to cut out some of the grass around the edges. But give it a try. That as far as a weed barrier, you could put down a plastic weed barrier first underneath the mulch. Same idea. That's a good way to kill what's underneath that mulch. It's not necessarily going to stop all weeds in the future, because the weed seeds will still blow in and you'll still have to pull out the weeds. I like having, again, with the idea of growing a soil. The soil, even the soil between my garden beds, I put no barriers underneath, because I want the air and the sun and the rain to be able to flow through the mulch, and my pathways in my vegetable garden beds and around my container garden beds is primarily pine needles and wood chips. And so I want them to decompose. I want them to feed the soil, because there's a lot of soil life outside your soil beds that affect the soil within your garden beds. And so this whole area out here, as I was putting in all those plants that I told you about, there was nothing there a year ago. and no life, compacted soil. My soil is terrible. I covered that area, the whole area, last year with about 4 inches of wood chip mulch throughout. This year, as I was digging the holes to put those plants in every hole I found an earthworm. So I went from a pretty sterile soil, very low in nutrients, with no observable soil life. But just by covering this whole stretch back here with wood chips, there's now life in that soil because the earthworms and the beetles and the arthropods of all types, of the nematodes and all the soil microbes can move freely around the beds. And the soil's being warmed by the sun and the rain is falling evenly around that area. If you put a barrier in your pathways that keeps the rain out and keeps that soil from warming up, you've now eliminated a highway system for the microbes and that soil life to move from bed to bed. And you might not see the results of it, but without that barrier and allowing the life to thrive, you'll probably get better results when those earthworms can move freely and when the soil is improved, not only in the bed, but outside the bed as well. So I'm not a huge fan of weed barriers. Cardboard will decompose and break down, and a lot of the glues used in cardboard is edible and actually a favorite food of earthworms. So the worms will probably eat your cardboard before they end up decomposing from bacterial action. But that would be my preferred method. And there's Made Gray Wolf, very knowledgeable gardener, had just seen that video on chlorinated water. So I'm glad you saw that. Yeah, I like Alberta Urban Gardens, a lot of his information, but a lot of it is older, and there's the link from Jay, who's always on top of things. So and yeah, once I saw that video long time ago and has since done some additional research, I'm not worried about the water at all. So thanks, Troy. I appreciate that super sticker. Thanks so much for supporting the channel and for being here and being active. It's always nice to see you, and of course the whole group. So thanks so much for that. And so, I just saw a question. Someone was asking, was that Heidi, about the bird poop landing in the garden? So I scrolled, how I win the water. And so the bird poop landing in the garden, here or there, is not a big deal. It will enrich the soil. And so if you've got a flock of birds flying over and they poop on the garden, some of it's going to land on your plants, some of it's going to land on the soil, and almost immediately it's going to be neutralized by your mulch and by the soil, and as far as a lot of the bacterial action within the bird poop. It's when it's resting in a bucket or a barrel of water, and the anaerobic bacteria takes over, and all those pathogens are in that water from a lot of the bird droppings. That's when it becomes an issue. Here or there, for thousands of years, birds have been pooping on gardens without an issue. So it's really nothing to be concerned about. It's when you have a lot of birds on a roof with a lot of poop, and then it rains, and then you're collecting that as a sludgy extract, that's when you need to be a little more concerned about it. So Degi, or Des Geese, thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate it, and nice to have you here. I appreciate that, and it's one of those kind of things that I just thank you so much for all the support you and everybody else give. I think it's awesome. I've been saying it's great to see so many who care about these very important things. It gives me hope for our children's future. Exactly, and that's exactly the point, and that's why I'm saying thank you, because it is nice to see everybody here sharing the information, talking. It's not just me. We've been on for 49 minutes now, and even if you're just coming into the stream right now, you can already see it's not just me talking. It's you all talking back and forth and helping each other out, asking the questions, answering the questions, sharing the information. It's definitely one of those kind of things that it's fantastic, I think, to be part of the Gardner Scott community, because it's more than just Gardner Scott. It is the whole community. And I just appreciate you all so much, especially Yankee Sista, who is here most Mondays, and we miss when you're not here. So thank you so much for that. And thank you. Those are very kind words. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you. And I appreciate every Monday that we can have you here as well. And Floppin', that's a new name to see with a super sticker. So thank you so much for that as well. This is fantastic. You guys are just so great. Yeah, Sheena's exactly right. It's absolutely a great community. And so it's one of those things that, so, you know, I know I'm getting old. I know my mind is beginning to fail. But this last weekend, we had our garden club plant sale. And it was hugely successful. We in the club grew extra plants to sell, and then the money we raise through our club, we typically donate to the fire department and the library, and depending on how much money we have at the end of the year, depends on how much and to whom we donate. And so I had every intention of making a video about garden clubs and plant sales and how you can get involved, because I've talked about this before. Getting involved with the gardening community locally is a great way to learn how to make your garden more successful, because you can rub elbows with other gardeners who are doing it at your location. And so I was going to film it all, and just had these grand aspirations to share what it's like to be at a plant sale of a garden club with your friends and with your neighbors coming to the sale. I was so busy for 5 hours. The sale ran for 5 hours. For 5 hours, I did nothing but just talk gardening to members of the club, to people who just showed up, to some who were buying plants, some who were selling plants. I talked about gardening for 5 hours. It was wonderful. I learned things. Of course, I shared information. And then I got home and I realized I hadn't taken a single picture. I hadn't done any of the filming that I had intended on doing to share with you all how wonderful it is to get together in a gardening community situation. Because I was enjoying the get-together so much, I forgot all about the business part, the video and the filming and the recording of it. I just enjoyed the moment. I enjoyed the people. I enjoyed the conversations, and it was a wonderful day. And so, point being, get out there, and this is one community where we share thoughts from around the world, but do try to find something local where you can actually face-to-face talk to fellow gardeners and learn some of the things that you need to learn. And I think you can tell I'm excited, and it was a happy day for me. And so I encourage that you get out there and find a happy day like that too. So it was a very productive weekend. MW is saying planted most everything. Yeah, I had a pretty productive weekend too. Didn't get much done on that Saturday because plant sale took up most of the day, but I put in a bunch of plants already, a bunch of seeds already. After this today, I'm going back out to do more seeds. And by Wednesday, my vegetable garden should be fully planted, because the temperatures are finally at the point they need to be. I wish it wasn't this late in the year, but that's just the reality of gardening. That's just the way it happens sometimes. So I'm glad to see you're out in the garden, glad that you're getting stuff done, and I'm definitely looking forward to getting out there and getting all this stuff done. Thanks so much, SJK. I love you all too. That's wonderful. Dusty Flats is going to try the black crim. It's so funny. I love black crim. Black crim, I've said many times, is my favorite tomato to grow. And I grew, I think I had like 30 tomato plants that I had taken to the plant sale, but probably half a dozen different varieties, maybe 8 different varieties, to include black crim. And the very last plants that were left, everything else had sold. The very last plants that were left of mine were the black Krim. And in my mind, they were better than any of the others that I had offered. And I had to actually talk someone into getting those black Krim tomatoes to grow because, like, you know, my area, it's tough. Other gardeners know it's tough. And so when you can find someone and they can tell you, hey, I live near you and I'm growing this plant in my garden and it does very well, that's the kind of advice to listen to. And so I love black Krim, and black Krim does well for many gardeners. It doesn't do as well. I think it was Scott Head who has the Black Gumbo channel down in southern Texas. And I think we might have been chatting about this. Black Krim doesn't do well for him in his garden. It's a Russian tomato. It comes from a region that has weather and has a climate not too different from mine. And so it makes perfect sense that black Krim would do well in my garden, which is why I recommend it. But do be aware, because all of our gardens are different, that specific variety might not do best for you, but give it a try because you may find out it does great and tastes great and looks great. And I just love it. So I'm definitely growing more of the black Krim. And so there's a tomato I haven't heard of before. And from N4B1K1, the Seo His Hong Shi. Interesting. I've never heard of that. I'll have to look that up. A small oval yellow and sweet tomato. I'm always looking for new ideas. So I'll have to make note of that and look that up. I don't even remember coming across that. So thank you for suggesting that. And Melissa says that folks grow brandywine and black Krim where she is. And the Krims are early and the brandywine are late. Yeah. And I can't grow. I've tried growing brandywines here. And it gets back to the idea, brandywines, are typically in that 105 day category. And so even though the clock starts when you put the plant in the ground, you have to give yourself that extra week buffer for everything to go right. And the few times that I've been able to harvest a brandywine here in Colorado has been a couple days before the first frost hits in fall. And so I'd love to grow more brandywine, but for me in my season, I've learned it doesn't work. But that's exactly why the black Krim does great, because it ripens early. It's a pretty fast tomato, and so in a short season area, I got to take advantage of it, and I do, absolutely. So Blue Roses, Diane, got to run. We'll replay. Garden's calling, absolutely. And go out to the garden. Love you, Gardener Scott. Awesome, thank you so much. Hugs to you in Pennsylvania as well. Have fun gardening, and we'll see you on the replay as well. And that's what's so nice about the replay. Even if you come in late, if you're just now joining us, you can either keep watching and then go back and do the replay, or just go back and click at the start of the time stream, and you'll be behind us by half an hour or however long it's been since you clicked on. But always good information. So I appreciate when everybody gets that opportunity to watch the whole show. You don't have to just watch from where you click to the end. Go back and watch the beginning as well, because there's so much good information. I like going back and just seeing the comments of what everybody is saying. Marcia says, something is eating large holes in the pole bean leaves. Can't see a pest, and the remainder of the leaf looks fine. Know what it might be? It could be, well, it depends on the size of the hole. And so if it's a circular hole, and if it's large, it could be a leaf cutter bee. I was one of 2 years ago now. I had that issue, and it's like, what's going on? And I paid special, close, regular attention to that plant, and then I saw a leaf cutter bee cutting the hole out of the leaf. And that was the first time I'd actually seen the bee on the plant. Again, so excited in the moment that I didn't grab my camera to film it, and I didn't have my phone with me to take any pictures or film it as well. And that may be, if it's a large hole and it's pretty circular, it could be a leafcutter bee. Most other insects tend to have patterns where they'll chew from the outside in, or they'll make little holes, but a lot of little holes. And so first thought, if it's a large hole, is a leafcutter bee. And so look that up and see if maybe the holes match. Otherwise, pay close attention to the plant, and both early in the morning and in the early evening, and see if maybe you can catch the culprit at work. And then it'll give you an idea of just exactly what it is that you need to do if you want to control it. The leafcutter bees really don't harm the plant. They just take a little hole out of the leaf. The leaf is still alive, the plant's still alive, and then the bees go back. They're using that material for their nest, and you've got extra pollinators in your garden. So I wouldn't worry much about it at all if it is a leafcutter bee. Okay, let's see. Joe Riddle is asking, ants are terrible this year and particularly voracious. Any tips on how to get rid of them? Will diatomaceous earth harm my earthworms? And do ants eat seedlings? So ants don't normally eat seedlings. They might, there are ants that will cut leaves and carry portions of the leaves back down into their nest. They're often after something else on the plant. You've probably heard about, the ants that herd the aphids because they're collecting the exudate from the aphid, that sweet material that the aphids are exuding, and so that might be why they're on your plants. Diatomaceous earth can work. The way diatomaceous earth works is it has little sharp edges and will scrape up the undersides of the bodies of the insects, and it doesn't tend to work as effectively on ants, but it can. And because diatomaceous earth will be spread on the surface of the soil or on the plant itself for best effect to keep the ants off, then it's not going to bother the earthworms. The earthworms are underneath, and they eat a lot of stuff that's bigger and more jagged than the diatomaceous earth. So it's not going to harm the earthworms. I try to balance the damage that the ants are doing with the benefits that they provide. And so, especially in my area with compacted soil and with poor soil, I just let my ants go. And I was walking yesterday through an area that I haven't mulched yet. I'm still developing it. And I noticed lots of little mounds of the ants that are starting to move into that area. That's exactly what I want. I want ants to dig their tunnels through my compacted soil. I want them bringing that organic material that they're carrying down to the nest, because that will benefit my soil. That's one of those ways to grow your soil, is actually to allow that life, to include the ants, to improve your soil for you. So if they're not damaging your plants to excess, and they're really not in the way, I say let them go. If you want to control them, there are some methods. Boiling water, you can use borax, you can just pour a little bit of vinegar around the edges of the plant. There are lots of ways to disrupt them. But I would instead question whether you need to get rid of them, because they may be providing some benefits that you're not even aware of, especially benefiting the soil through their tunnels. They're adding aeration, and they're giving pathways for the rain to get into the soil at deeper levels, all of which can be really good, especially when you're in a dry region like mine. So consider that. Do a little more thinking as to whether you really want to get rid of them. And if you've got a whole bunch of them, then yes, you can take some of those corrective actions to include chemical control. And all you have to do is just do an online search for how to control ants, and you'll come across dozens of chemicals that you can use to control your ants. And then you'll come across some of those methods like like using borax and using boiling water and using vinegar and methods like that. So depends on which approach you want to take, but you should be able to find a lot of information out there if you do a simple search. Mayday Garden is asking a question. Oh, I just had it and then it popped away. So there we go. I need to move my 2-year-old 18-gallon raised bed, but it's too heavy to lift. Will I damage the soil earthworms when I empty it and put it back when moved? Possibly. And so when we talk about the soil structure, there are a lot of elements involved with that. The health of the soil, the tilth of the soil, what kind of composition you have within your soil, the organic matter, and particularly the fungal activity kind of binds everything together. And so when you disrupt your soil, that's one of the things that you tend to disrupt the most, is the mycelial growth, all that fungal action in the soil. It can recover pretty quickly. I am not as concerned about the bacterial action within the soil as far as disrupting it, because the bacteria tend to be more widespread through the soil. But yes, there will be some disruption, but as long as you're providing them with the moisture and the food and the heat, they should recover pretty quickly. And so not sure when you need to move, but go ahead and move it so that you don't hurt yourself. Fill it back up, and when you fill back up with the soil, great opportunity to incorporate some more organic matter into the soil. Go ahead and throw some compost in as you're filling the bed up again, and it'll be disrupted. You can still probably plant in it right away, but it will take time for it to get back to the point where it is right now, because you've got 2 years of all that fungal and bacterial growth that's developed, and it might take half that time to get back to where it was, assuming you care for it, assuming you are growing the soil and taking the care you need to take with all of that life, and you should be fine. It's better to move a bed to an area where it needs to be and you can use it effectively, and then allow the soil to recover, than to not move it and then maybe not grow plants or not garden in that space because it's where you don't want it to be. Put it where you want it to be, put it in the best location for you, and the soil will catch up. You'll be able to recover from that without too much trouble. Greg lives in Omaha, Nebraska, and every May my entire yard gets an herbicide drift. I have no idea who or where it comes from. Do I just wait until my grapes show damage to plant veggies? That's an interesting question. And so many of us live in neighborhoods where our neighbors are spraying, and you've got no control over it. And it could be a neighbor 2 or 3 houses away on a windy day, and it all comes to your area. A lot of it depends on what you're growing. And so if it's a spray from lawns, the herbicide, if that's what it is they're spraying, is targeting broadleaf plants. And so if you are using those grass clippings in your garden as a mulch, you could be bringing some of that herbicide residue into your vegetable garden, and your vegetables that have broad leaves, that have the big leaves, could be affected. And so using the grapes as an indicator is an interesting idea. You can do that. If you have a broadleaf plant like grapes that will show that herbicide damage, you can use that and make note of it on your calendar. Or consider putting up a barrier. Now, this may or may not be effective depending on how bad the drift is, but put hoops over your beds, and then cover those hoops with a material like a row cover, a fabric, a woven fabric material over those hoops. The air can still get in, the sun can still get in, the rain can still get in. The herbicide is less likely to get in. It might actually be filtered by the fabric. And so drifting residue might stay off your plants if you put a barrier like that over your plants. So consider that as an option and see how it works. And if it works, then that might be an easy solution so it doesn't affect your planting calendar too much. So that might be an approach that I would take is a barrier. And depending on the weather and depending on how hot it gets, plastic. If you put plastic over those hoops, you'll definitely keep the herbicide drift off. It's just whether it'll get too hot underneath the plastic. So it might be a lot of work going back and forth, covering and uncovering, but I would consider that as a viable option to keep the herbicides off my plants. And then, yeah, use the grapevines as an indicator of when that drift has hit your garden. And so if you have the barrier in place and then your grapes are affected, now you can take the barriers off because you already know that drift has occurred and you don't need those barriers anymore. So put all those factors together and see if maybe that might give you some ideas of how to approach it, and it should be good at that point. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the things you can buy to grow your soil, to make your soil better, and whether they're needed or not needed. And so I talked earlier about earthworms, just discovering earthworms in areas that I know did not have earthworms over the last 3 years. And you can buy worms to put in your garden. However, I'm a big advocate of just letting nature populate your garden. So I did not buy earthworms and spread them in this area of the garden that now has worms. All I did was cover that area with a thick layer of mulch, and the worms showed up. So there's some patience involved. There is a time factor, but I don't have the confidence that the worms I would be buying will even survive my cold winters and hot summers and compacted soil and dry soil and all the rest of it. But I know that the worms that found their way into my garden will survive because they showed up naturally, which means they're native to this area and know how to survive in my area. And that holds true for a lot of other things like the mycelia that you can buy, the fungi spores that you can spread on your soil and allow them to grow. Same basic idea. There are thousands of species of fungi that will be in our garden beds. And so if you buy from whatever the source and they're selling you 4 or 5 different strains, it may or may not match with what will survive in your garden. And so I tend to think that it's a waste of money for a lot of those products, and I prefer to add the compost and do the mulch and grow my soil naturally with what's native to my area, because there are millions, billions of fungal spores in my garden on any given day. And when the environment is right for them to grow, they're going to grow. We've had a very, very dry late winter and early spring here in Colorado. We did start getting some moisture. We had a really heavy snow about a week and a half ago. We had a day of rain this last week. And I noticed yesterday as I was going through the garden that in one section of my vegetable garden, in my vegetable garden beds, I have mushrooms growing. Now, I did not buy mycelial spores to spread in my garden. I just provided an environment that would be healthy for the fungi to grow. And they're growing. The mushrooms are just the fruit bodies of the fungi that's growing underneath the soil. So that tells me I'm doing something right. As soon as they got all the moisture they needed, they started growing. I could have gotten out sooner, but my hose was frozen. But that's the idea. If you give them the environment, however early you get to it, then the life is going to spring up. You don't necessarily need to buy a booster or something that's going to, or being sold as something that's going to make it better. It might not. Just create the environment to grow your soil and grow the life within your soil. Won't cost you anything, and you should see good results as a result of that. And so Chris is asking, do you know of a place I can buy mushroom spores? So there's a whole bunch of places online. I tried growing mushrooms in this last year in this area over here next to my house in straw bales. And I got from a couple different sources. I don't remember them off the top of my head. But I grew blue oyster mushrooms. And so just do a simple search of grow your own mushrooms or something along those lines, and you'll see a bunch of stuff pop up. I'm sure that others will give you, yeah, there you go, North Spore. Actually, I think North Spore was one of those companies that I had bought the spores that I got. So thank you for that. Go for it. Yeah, growing your own mushrooms is also another great thing. Not only will the underground activity benefit the soil, but now you have a mushroom that you know you can eat. And my humidity is just too dry, so I was able to have some success growing in straw bales that I watered 3 times a day and that were mostly in the shade. I wouldn't be able to grow mushrooms in my open garden space for the most part, which is why the mushrooms that pop up like I saw this week, they're going to be gone in a couple days. But they're native. They're natural part of this area that I live in, and so I let them go and I let them grow, and it's all good. Patty's saying, with all the earthworms I have in my compost bin, I wonder how much of my compost is worm casting. Look rich and black. Is there a way to tell? So yes, you could take samples from your compost pile and get a microscope and look in the microscope at how much of it is raw or rough organic matter, because the castings have a very distinct shape. It's worm poop. So you can get at that level and be able to identify the worm castings when compared to everything else. And then with that kind of analysis, yeah, you could figure out what the percentage is of worm castings in your compost. So I'm not sure how else you could do it other than that, but there's one way to do it. It's actually get scientific and get in there and see what you can see. There are advocates of doing that. Elaine Ingham, Dr. Elaine Ingham, who has the soil food web information, she thinks we should all have microscopes and we should be monitoring our soil. And so if you want the best possible soil, it varies depending on what the plants are that you're growing. And so you can take that scientific approach with your soil. And that's what she recommends, is that we take soil samples and we look at, underneath a microscope, the soil life. And that gives us an indication of whether we need to add more organic matter or add a different type of organic matter, and maybe do a different plant in a bed based on the makeup of the life within our soil. You can get down to that level of analysis when it comes to your soil. And so depending on the balance that we are looking for with the soil life, you might be deficient. You might not have enough nematodes. You might not have enough of whatever, because there are dozens of different types of soil life that you can see underneath a microscope. And so when you recognize that you're deficient in that particular soil life, you now start introducing the foods or the moisture or whatever the component might be to encourage that type of life. That's how you can grow your soil to a very specific type of soil. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, there's a lot of science involved, but you can definitely take that approach. And I haven't done that. I on my list of videos to make is to actually get the microscope and to get the computer link so that you can actually view through the microscope and then play it on your computer, and then of course do a video about that at some point in the future. I'm not there yet. It's not on my list for this year. Who knows when I'll get to it, but there's an option. You can take that approach if you really want to get your soil perfect. I mean, scientifically perfect. There are so many other factors involved with gardening that a perfect soil is a great way to start growing plants. Then you figure out all the rest of what you need to do to keep the plants alive, and you should have amazing success. Mary Austin, and this is one of those reasons I don't like buying things, because you never know what you're going to get. I've noticed a crazy amount of jumping worms in my garden. Are they as bad as we are told? So jumping worms are becoming a problem in many areas of the United States. And they call it a jumping worm just because it's so active when it moves. It's an earthworm. It's just one type of earthworm. And because it's so active that it looks like it's jumping across the ground, that's where it got its name. They in the regions they're becoming are becoming a problem. They have the environment that they need. They have the food, they have the moisture, they have the heat. We don't have jumping worms here in Colorado yet because our winters are just too cold for them. And so I'm guessing you live in a much warmer region than me. All they're doing, and there's more to it, but is eating the organic matter faster than the other earthworms that were there first. And so the native earthworms for most of us are relatively slow, relatively lazy. They eat, they improve the soil. They are just one of the many decomposers of organic matter in the soil. The jumping worm, because it repopulates so quickly, eats a lot faster. And so the problem is really more in forest areas where there's a lot of organic matter, the leaves that are falling in autumn, and there's a cycle, a natural cycle, where those leaves decompose and enrich the soil over a period of time. When the jumping worm comes in, they essentially eat so much of that material, so much of that organic matter that's falling in the forest that it disrupts the normal cycle. And so scientists really aren't completely sure yet of what the long-term effect will be in those forested areas where the jumping worms have just eaten way more than the regular earthworms would normally eat. And so that's why it's being seen as a problem. For those of us in our garden settings, I don't think, now I don't have any studies, I haven't seen any studies that talk about jumping worms in a home garden. But my own reasoning is it's not that big a deal. They're going to eat the organic matter you have in your soil, but that's a good thing because we're trying to improve our soil. And as long as you're adding more organic matter, you can keep a pretty good cycle. And they may or may not survive the winter. So it might be a temporary increase in their population in your home garden. So I don't think it's that big a problem in a home garden. It's more when they are growing by the millions in a natural habitat and they're disrupting that habitat. That's really what the problem tends to be. So for you, Mary, I don't think they're as bad for us, for we gardeners at home. And so I wouldn't be that concerned about it. But observe. You probably have noticed what regular earthworms look like, and notice within your own garden if you see that the jumping worms are taking over, if they're pushing out that other soil life, then maybe it might be an indicator that they could be a potential problem in the future. And we can talk about that on another day. So hopefully that helps out. And so this does start to highlight the differences that we have in our gardens. For some of us, jumping worms aren't even a consideration. For others, it could be a big issue, and probably a whole bunch of us fall somewhere in between. And I wanted to talk today a little bit about, so this is my garden. I've already talked a little bit about it. I took this picture this morning right before I came on live. just because my garden is finally green. I finally have stuff growing and things are popping up. I wanted to highlight this right here, this apple tree I had in a video just a few weeks ago, and it's already flowering. This is a columnar apple tree, and I'm going to have apples on it in the first year. I think that's just absolutely incredible. These are rhubarb flowers that I showed in a recent video. The bees love those, but they're aging and they're starting to go to seed, and so I'll be cutting those stalks down because I don't want a bunch of rhubarb seed, and the bees are no longer using it. In this area over here, you can see this is an asparagus stalk, and some of the other asparagus at the bottom here, it's all bent over. It got buried underneath the snow, and a lot of my asparagus broke or bent, so I'm keeping a close eye on it. But in general, the garden looks really good. To me, it looks really good. But I get comments occasionally that you know, I've talked about this before too, that wonder why my garden looks the way it looks. And so I think it looks beautiful right now, but it probably doesn't have a fraction of some of the plants that some of you are already seeing. And so the raspberry video that I did this last week, I had a few comments wondering why my raspberries are so small, because their raspberries are already 3 feet tall. Well, we all garden in different areas, different climates, different soils, and different plants. And so the reason my raspberries are smaller may be because of the variety, but it's probably because until this week, my soil's been pretty cold and my days have been pretty cold, and the raspberries are just now starting to grow. But in the other area of my garden, my garlic is doing great. And I had those kind of comments as well. Why isn't my garlic looking as good as your garlic? And there's a lot of factors involved. The weather factor, the soil factor. Could be that you're not mulching and I am mulching. The point I want to end with today is try not to compare your garden with someone else's garden. Try not to wonder why you're doing it wrong or why yours doesn't look like someone else's, with the assumption that there's a problem. Don't look at it that way. You got to look at your own garden. And when you compare gardens, compare this year's garden with last year's garden or the garden 5 years ago. And so when I see this plant right here, this is tarragon just over my shoulder. I don't remember my tarragon being that big this early in the year. So is it bigger than your tarragon? Who cares? Is it smaller than your tarragon? Who cares? I don't worry about that at all. Instead, I say, okay, this tarragon's looking pretty darn good and it's doing better than it's ever done before. So now I start thinking, why? What did I do right? What was different? The weather patterns, the moisture, all that kind of stuff. That's how I approach gardening. How can I learn from the changes that are happening within my own garden based on the experience that I've been developing over the last couple years in this garden? And that's how I move forward. I watch a lot of the same videos you watch from all those channels from around the world, and I would love my garden to look as lush and full as those channels in Australia and Southern California and Texas and the places where they've already been growing for 3 months and are just now starting to harvest tomatoes, and I'm just now planting my tomatoes. So I'm not going to let it bother me that I'm not harvesting tomatoes yet. That's just the way it works in Colorado in my garden. And that's the way I encourage you to look at it as well. Just do what's right for you. And don't look at my garden. Don't look at anyone else's garden and compare what's happening with you and your plants with what's happening with us and our plants. Sure, we got a lot to share. I share my successes. I share my failures at the different times of year. And the different times of year probably don't match up with the time of year that you're doing it. But you can still learn from all of us that are sharing this information. All of you who have been commenting back and forth today and every Monday that we get together. You can learn from other people's gardens. You can learn from other gardeners and how they do it, but don't think that your garden will ever look like someone else's garden. It's only going to look like your garden. And that should be your focus, is trying to get your garden to grow to that point that makes you happy, that gives you the satisfaction, so that you can have those successes and that you can share what you've learned with all of the other gardeners who are struggling just like we all are. And so I chuckle a little bit when I see comments like that they don't, it's usually a brand new viewer. They don't know I'm in Colorado. They don't know that I have the harsh conditions that I do. And they're wondering why I would have a YouTube channel talking about gardening when my garden looks so terrible. Well, no, my garden doesn't look terrible. My garden looks exactly the way it should look every day of the year. Maybe I think it could be better. Maybe I think it looks great, but that's for me to figure out in my garden, and that's for you to figure out for your garden as well. So move forward with a positive view of what you're doing, and don't try to be distracted by someone else who may look better in your opinion. That's okay. Learn from them. Maybe expand so that your garden can reach that point someday. But for today, be happy with what you've got. Be happy with what you're doing. And of course, above all, enjoy gardening. We'll see you here next Monday as we do this all over again. It's so great to have you here. Thank you so much for your participation and your support. And I hope you have a great gardening week. I'll see you then.